So moving on to the last section of this week's podcast, and I'm going to talk about podcasts, and the podcasts that I watch and that I follow and I like to keep on top of. I'm not going to mention all of the podcasts that I dip in and out of, because there are some that I'll just watch occasionally, some that I quite like, but these are the main ones that I subscribe to and try to keep on top of. Obviously, if you have any other recommendations, feel free to comment down below or to hop on over to the Ravelry group, and we can have a chat in there about what podcasts to watch. So from a knitting perspective, I really enjoy watching Cozy Up Knits, which is for Canadian sisters. They design their own knitting patterns, and they are varying levels of knitting experience. So you've got Jamie's the oldest, and Sarah, so they started off the podcast and the designing to begin with, and then they have younger twin sisters, Katie and Chrissy, I believe. Yeah, Katie and Chrissy. They're identical twins. Chrissy's the newest knitter, but is really keen on sock knitting, so she's always got socks on the go. The relationship between them is fantastic. They all have children, so they talk about their kids a lot. They knit for their children. Their mum knits and makes project bags. They tend to film in their mum's kitchen, so that she's looking after the kids whilst they're filming, and you quite often see other members of the family sort of walking across in the background, and it's just a really nice laid back fun podcast. They also do little tutorials to go with their knitting patterns, so that's good. Then obviously there's Knitting Expat, which is Mina Phillip. Obviously I'm clearly going to be keen on Mina. I've knitted quite a lot of her stuff. I'm in her sock clubs. I've done a few test knits for her now. I've got another jumper of hers ready to go. So yeah, I really like Mina's designs. I like her laid back approach to her podcast, the fact that she does vlogs alongside the podcasts, so you get to see her little girl Layla growing up. She has done a Fibre Friends question session with her husband as well, which is really entertaining. So yeah, she's a good one to follow. And she's got a really good giveaway going on at the moment with Kromski, which is a Polish spinning wheel company. So definitely worth checking her out. Then obviously Skein-Dir. Skein-Dir is the queen of colourwork as far as I can tell. The way she explains things is brilliant. She's an educator in her podcast. She's an educator when she writes her patterns. You really learn stuff. As I say, she has taken a step back a little bit from the frequency of podcasting at the moment, as she's working on her thesis, which is obviously a massive undertaking. And by early next year, she'll have finished her PhD and be Dr. Skein-Dir, which would be fabulous. As I say, she's a Norwegian. She lives in London. She podcasts in English, but has been featured on Norwegian language podcasts as well. Not that I've watched them, as I would not have a clue what was going on. I am tempted to get a Norwegian pattern though, based on following her podcast, because the way that she explains the difference between the way Norwegians write patterns and the way that we have patterns in the US and in the UK, I think for a colourwork pattern, I might be able to work it out, because from what I gather, they're not big on instructions when it comes to doing their patterns. So with the chart and knowing my stitch counts and my measurements, I might possibly be able to work out a Norwegian pattern. So I'll have to see if I can find one for sort of free or cheap to have a first go on, I think. I don't want to spend a lot of money on something and then find I can't work it. But she has given me a lot of confidence in how I work with patterns. I mean, this pattern, she doesn't tell you how much to increase by during the yoke. She gives you the formula to work it out yourself. So she really sort of enabling you with those tools to go and work with patterns that have fewer instructions. She has great sock patterns, she has great mitten patterns. She started off doing Selby mittens as a designer, and has now expanded into other things. She has a Selby mitten club each year, or she has done for the past 2 years anyway, and she's doing her second lot of mystery mittens for the festive season this year. The last pair were beautiful. There's a window and a cat looking out the window. I didn't knit those ones, but I'm very tempted to give this year's ones a go. But I'm not going to be able to start when the mystery long starts, because it starts this week, and I don't have the funds to get the yarn until at least the end of the month. So if I do them, and then there'll be a little bit of a spoiler going on, but that's all right. Moving along to Babel's Travelling Yarns. That's Grace, who is based in Ireland, and she started doing knitting retreats in the Republic of Ireland as well. She's got a massive personality. She's really funny. She's got a gorgeous cat. She does knit-alongs as well. She's currently knitting a jumper of her own design for her partner, who has a similar issue to mine with choosing clothes, in that he is quite tall. So getting the right length can be a bit of an issue, I've discovered, for my partner, who's tall and skinny, although Grace's is a bit more broad than my other half. But it can make knitting patterns a challenge, and buying clothes a challenge. So she's actually designing her own jumper for him. You get to see the progress she's making on that. And she weaves as well. I have yet to find a purely weaving podcast to follow to learn about my weaving. So occasionally you will see videos from me on weaving, and there are tutorial videos out there on weaving. There's how to warp your loom and how to do various different techniques, but I haven't found one where somebody is just talking about weaving. But Grace includes that in her knitting podcast. She is a dyer as well, so she does hand-dyed yarn under the brand name Babel's Travelling Yarns. And so she's well worth a watch. She's really entertaining. There's quite a few knitting podcasts, so bear with me. The next podcast I've already mentioned is Vine. She who designed that sparkling cider hat. I also have on the needles, in a bit of time out, the Oracle shawl that she's designed. It's not on timeout for any particular reason, other than I had some test knits come in and take over, and I just haven't got back into knitting on a lace and brioche circular shawl since. So I will do. I'm just going to clear a few other projects that have got deadlines out of the way first, so probably come the new year I'll get back into that one. So again, Vine, she's a knitter, she's a dyer. She used to be known as Yarngasm on the podcast, but she's rebranded to match her social media handle and her yarn brand to the podcast. It's all Vine now. So she designs, she knits, she dyes. She's started weaving, so she has mentioned weaving a little bit on her podcast, and she also sews a bit as well. So you'll see her sewing projects occasionally, and she's based in New York. Which is why I haven't really bought much from her. The cost of the yarn and the cost of the shipping, just to get the quantities that are worth doing for shipping and customs and jumpers and that kind of stuff, at the moment I'm not financially able to do that, but that is a dream down the line, to have some Vine to knit with. Then we get to a pair of Australians who live in Germany, of all places. Fruity Knitting, which is a great name for a podcast. It's a husband and wife team, and the wife is far more experienced in knitting. It's Andrea and Andrea, I think. So Andrea is very experienced in knitting, and she passes on her expertise with little mini tutorials as part of their quite lengthy podcast. It's usually over an hour long, hour and a half to 2 hours sometimes. But it is highly educational. It's every couple of weeks. It's their full-time job. Andrew's been learning to knit. He's knitting socks a lot at the moment, and he's been working on a few jumper projects. So he knitted a Carbeth for their daughter, who occasionally features on the podcast. She's off at university now, but she occasionally pops up. And they also do lots of interviews with designers and makers. They did a whole series from Shetland Wool Week. So it's a highly educational podcast to follow. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more knitting podcasts to talk about, and then some sewing ones. told you there's a few. So next we have Knitting Vicariously. So as I say, this is Caroline, who is Dundonit. She's relatively new on the podcasting scene. About as new as I am, as I say. She's a bit more sweary than I am. I have to watch my language because of my full-time job. I can't be seen using language in a public domain, particularly because it's not a very good example to set to the children that I work with. Whereas Caroline is not a podcaster to watch with small children around. It's not like she turns the air blue or anything, but some of the language that she naturally uses is not suitable for young ears. And she's very open and honest about that at the beginning of her podcast. She introduces herself every week explaining that it is a podcast where she is going to be swearing. So there's no sort of hiding it. It's not swearing by stealth or anything. But she is hilarious. I really enjoy watching her podcast, and the Ravelry group that goes along with it is very active. The whole premise behind her podcast is that we don't always have time to cast on what we want to cast on, so we can knit vicariously by watching what other people knit, which is a great concept to have behind it. And yeah, I really enjoy watching hers. Next we have Squirrel Pie Productions, which is Tommy, who's known as Dynamite Trujillo on social media and is the dye behind Moonstone Dye Works. She is based in North Carolina. No, not North Carolina, North California. Sorry, Tommy, North California. She just tell you every week as well. She's recently become a mother to a gorgeous little girl. So she took a bit of time out from dyeing and podcasting whilst that was going on, understandably so. She's quite chilled, she's quite laid back. It's a really gentle podcast. So she's a lot of fun to watch as well, and she tells you about her baby and what's going on. She did some vlogs through Vlogtober as well. Just jotting down a couple more podcasts that I forgot to write on my list. They keep coming to me. I just don't want to miss any that when I come to do my show notes, and that's Kiki hopping in the background. So then let's talk Legacy Fibre Arts. This is a mother-daughter team. They are dyers and they are knitters, and there's another baby in it as well. So you occasionally see mother, daughter, granddaughter. The baby is very young, she's a few months old. But they are, again, very relaxed, very chilled. They do some gorgeous colourways, but again, being in the States, the cost of importing it just puts it out of my reach at the moment. But I do really like their colourways. And yeah, again, they tend to be fairly long podcasts, usually around about an hour. Chelsea, the daughter, also on Instagram does do shorter podcasty type bits on Instagram TV. She used to do shorter like mini podcasts on YouTube, but she seems to have swapped over to Instagram a bit more for those now. Then we have Salapalooza, who is Norwegian. She's in Bergen and she podcasts in English. Again, she's nice and chilled. She's just started doing knitting patterns for socks quite recently. And again, another one I really enjoy. I like the chilled podcast that I can just sit and knit to. Moving to another British podcaster, we have Not Quite Enough Yarn, which is Leslie on the South Coast. She's older than most of the podcasters I follow. It's like sitting in a room with your aunt and chatting about knitting and tea and generally having a bit of a giggle. So she has a massive yarn stash that she is trying to knit from, but the name of the podcast comes from where she quite often finds in her stash she doesn't have quite enough of one colour for the project that she's working on. So she's very entertaining, and she tends to film in little bits across the month and compiles them together at the end of the month, so you get to see her progress on a project through the course of the month rather than from month to month, so that's quite interesting as well. And the last two that I'm going to mention is the Stranded podcast, which is Amy Florence of Stranded Dye Works. So again, another dyer. She quite often talks about the weather on the south coast of England. She talks about her trips to the States. She's there quite a lot for various different retreats and yarn events. So again, she does some great colourways. I just haven't chosen which one to get. Being a UK dyer, I'm more likely to buy the odd sort of single skein to do socks or a hat or something like that than I would be from American dyer, because I don't have the same postal and import charges to think about. But she's entertaining as well. She's quite well known for saying that she doesn't know stuff about stuff, but clearly she does. She knows how to knit. She knows how to run a business. I mean, she clearly knows stuff. And the last knitting podcast, or specifically knitting podcast, that I'm going to mention is Inside Number 23. This is another new mother, very new mother. She hasn't yet podcast since the baby was born. It's that new. So little Posy is only a couple of weeks old. That's, I'm trying to think of her first name. I think it's Katie. I want to say Katie. She works for Tilly and the Buttons, so she sews as well as knits, but the podcast is mainly knitting. She was vlogging all through October, despite being about to give birth, which is phenomenal. And yeah, she's another entertaining one. She shows you the sewing project she's been working on. She shows you the knitting that she's been working on. And another really relaxed, chilled out, sit and knit with me type blog. So that's my main knitting podcasts that I watch. I say main. I do dip in and out of quite a few others. But those are the ones I like to try and keep up with, or that I will sit and binge watch if I've got behind, just to get back on track with. There are a few sewing podcasts that I watch as well. And I would imagine quite a few of you have come over from the Kittenish Behaviour Facebook group that goes alongside Sian's podcast. Sian is based on the Isle of Wight, so immediately I'm attracted to that with my family connection there. But she will do a daily vlog, so they're short. It's usually about what she's been up to that day. Sometimes it's tips and tricks and techniques for the sewing projects that she's been working on. She does sew-alongs for patterns, and it's like spending time with your mates. So I'll have that in the background whilst I'm tracing out patterns or knitting or marking books or planning lessons, just to keep me company. They tend to be quite short, and you get to meet her mum, who's known as the Quilting Queen by the Kittenish Behaviour community, and her dad, the Fabric Washing Fairy. So you get an insight into the family life as well. And yeah, it's really enjoyable, really friendly, and the Facebook group, oh my goodness, that is the best community on Facebook that I have joined in a long time. They're really active. It's not all sewing chat in there, it's a lot of life stuff as well, and you really feel like you're among friends when you're spending time in that group, so I highly recommend that. One of the girls that I know through the podcast that I came across through Kittenish Behaviour was So Pretty Kitty, who also posts as part of the Kittenish Behaviour Facebook group. So she's British, she's a sewist, and she does a lot of time sewing for herself and a lot of time sewing for her kids, so you get to see a mixture of patterns being made up, so that's good. Then there's the Fold Line, who I mentioned before when I was talking about Ravelry. So the Fold Line is now selling patterns. They were previously a forum, chat group, social media type platform with a pattern database, but they've redesigned their website. They've got an active Facebook group, which was more active than the forums. The forums weren't really getting a lot of chat because people preferred to be on Facebook. So the forums have gone, but the Facebook group is still there and still highly active, and they've started selling patterns through the Fold Line database, which is really good. So they've got a database of patterns that they have in stock and that they don't, and they're increasing the number that they have available to buy as well, because that's quite a new section to the website. But they also do podcasts, and they'll do a roundup of the new patterns that are coming out. They'll go into the high street at the change of seasons and see what trends are coming up and what we can actually translate into our own sewing and how we can actually do that to keep our sewing on trend as well. So that's a nice, interesting, informative podcast to watch. There's two more specifically sewing podcasts I wanted to mention. One is the Stitch Sisters, who tend to do quite short podcasts. They've started doing mystery shopping of online fabric stores. They run the Cozy Cardi Challenge. This is the second year they've run it this year. They do pattern reviews. They've recently set each other a stash challenge where they've chosen patterns from each other's pattern stash for the other one to sew up. And they have a really good relationship between them, so that's always entertaining to see. And the last specifically sewing podcast that I try and keep up with is Lauren Guthrie of Guthrie and Garney in Birmingham. Lauren was on the Great British Sewing Bee, as was Tilly and the Buttons, or Tilly of Tilly and the Buttons I should say, a few years ago now, which is how I came across Tilly and Lauren. Lauren now has her own fabric store that she runs with her husband. I believe they're married, partner, husband, one of the two, in Birmingham, as I say, and she will show the new fabrics that she's got in, but she will also show the projects that she's making and give you hints and tips on how to work with different fabric types. So again, it's quite an informative podcast to follow. So that's all the specifically sewing and specifically knitting podcasts that I follow. As I say, I haven't yet found a specifically weaving podcast to follow, so I am looking for recommendations there. There is one more crafty podcast that I wanted to mention, which is the Green Bean podcast. In fact, there's another one I need to mention. I was going to jot that one down too. But the Green Bean podcast is a sewist, a knitter, an artist. So she shows her sewing projects, she shows her knitting projects, and she shows her drawing. And it's another really gentle podcast to follow. She shows her going on a walk with her dog in the local countryside. I believe it's Devon that she's in. So that's a nice gentle podcast to follow. If I'm feeling a little bit worked up, I like to put that one on because she just calms me down. She's great. And one of her friends has the Tiny Fibre Studio podcast, which is a specifically spinning podcast. And she's doing the 51 yarns spin along. So she does a video for each of the yarns that Plied magazine recommend as part of their spin along. She's not linked to Plied at all. She just uses it as a resource. I believe the magazine's called Plied anyway. And her name is Becky. She's again based in Devon. Two cats. And yeah, that's another informative podcast to follow. As I'm very much a baby spinner. I spin a little bit on a drop spindle, I believe I've mentioned before, and I will show you one day. And I really want to graduate onto a wheel at some point and give that a try. So I find Becky's podcast really quite interesting. So that's all my crafty podcasts. I do occasionally dip in and out of an audio podcast called Things You Missed in History Class, which is really interesting, really educational, and really entertaining, because they tend to take the slightly more obscure parts of history, or the parts of history that are not fully covered in schools. It's an American podcast, so it does very much have that kind of focus, but it's interesting, it's entertaining, and when you're walking around, it's or sitting on a bus or a train journey for a long time, it's quite nice to have that on in the background. So that's my main podcasts. I told you there was a few. I really need to start listening to Insert Name Here as well, which is actually my cousin's podcast, with a couple of his mates. It's a geek podcast from what I gather. So if you're into sci-fi and fantasy and that kind of thing, maybe give that one a listen, see if you like it. I'm not going to specifically recommend it because I haven't actually listened to all of them yet myself, I've sort of dipped in and out a little bit, but yeah, it's my cousin, so I'm going to support him. So yeah, so that's all I have for you this week. I'm going to go and type up these notes and get this video sparkly and shiny and ready to upload. All in the name of avoiding report writing, because I really should do that. I've got 34 kids in my class to write reports for the end of term. We've only got a few weeks left, so I really need to get a start on that, because I need to have them in by next weekend, and to do some bit of planning and that sort of stuff for the week ahead. So I can't see me getting much in the way of knitting and sewing done today, but it has been almost an hour of me sitting chatting with you guys, which is obviously lovely, but I need to get on with my work now, I suppose. Report writing is not the most fun part of teaching, but it has to be done. It is important, it is useful. So I will leave you there. Do like and subscribe down below. Do let me know if you know of any weaving podcasts or any more spinning podcasts as well. I've only got the one. And hop on over to YouSewYou to read the blog. It's yousewYou.com, and pop on into the Ravelry group. I'm there by myself at the moment, so I am ready and waiting. I will be putting the show notes in there once they are typed up, and I will be popping a link to that on the blog as well. I'll link to the group down in the What's It underneath. And I will see you next time. Bye.